There are things you think you'll never recover from. Losing your husband at 31 years old is one of them. You assume that's the worst thing that will ever happen to you, that nothing could ever hurt, as much as watching the person you built your life around simply cease to exist. You assume that after surviving something like that, you've earned a certain immunity to further devastation. You're wrong. Because 6 years after I buried my husband, I discovered a truth about his mother that made me question everything I thought I knew about the man I loved, the marriage I'd treasured, and the grief I'd carried for years. A truth that forced me to grieve all over again, not just for the man I lost, but for the version of him I thought I knew. My name is Margaret, and this is the story of how the dead can still surprise you. Let me take you back to the beginning. I met Thomas at a graduate school orientation in the fall of 2009. I was studying literature, he was studying architecture, and we ended up standing next to each other at a buffet table, both reaching for the same cheese plate at exactly the same moment. He laughed, I blushed, and 3 hours later we were still talking in a corner of that crowded room while everyone else filed out. Thomas was unlike anyone I'd ever met. He was thoughtful and quiet, but when he spoke, every word seemed carefully chosen, deliberate. He had a way of listening that made you feel like you were the only person in the world. He was kind, genuinely, consistently kind, in a way that felt increasingly rare. We dated for 2 years before he proposed, got married in a small ceremony in the garden of a bed and breakfast upstate, and built a life together that felt, in the most profound way, like coming home. But Thomas had a complicated relationship with his mother, Eleanor. Even before we married, I could sense the tension between them. Eleanor was a tall, elegant woman in her late 50s, with silver hair she wore swept back, and a way of looking at you that felt like being assessed by a judge. She was intelligent, cultured, and completely certain that her opinions were correct. She was also deeply, possessively devoted to Thomas. He was her only child, born late in life, after what she'd described vaguely as years of disappointment. His father had died when Thomas was 12, leaving Eleanor to raise him alone. The bond between them was intense, and Eleanor had never fully accepted the idea that Thomas could love someone else. "She'll come around," Thomas always told me. "She just needs time." But Eleanor didn't come around. She was polite to me at family dinners and holiday gatherings, but there was always an undercurrent of disapproval in the way she looked at me. I was too casual, too independent, too academic. I didn't cook elaborate meals or keep an immaculate house, and Eleanor seemed to count these things against me. "Thomas deserves someone who will really take care of him," she said to me once, so casually that I almost missed the cruelty of it. Thomas, for his part, would apologize for her and defend her in equal measure. She grew up in a different time. She shows love differently. Deep down, she just wants me to be happy. I chose to believe that, because Thomas believed it, and I trusted Thomas completely. We were married for 4 years before he was diagnosed with the brain tumor. A glioblastoma, the kind of diagnosis that doctors deliver quietly, in serious voices, while handing you brochures about palliative care. The kind of diagnosis that doesn't come with a real treatment plan, only a timeline. Thomas was 33 years old. What followed was 18 months of surgery, radiation, chemotherapy, clinical trials, and hope that flickered and dimmed by degrees. Thomas was extraordinary throughout all of it, braver and more graceful in dying than most people manage to be in living. He kept working as long as he could, kept laughing, kept loving me with everything he had. Eleanor was present throughout his illness, of course. She came every weekend, sometimes during the week too. She cooked for us, cleaned our apartment, sat with Thomas for hours while I worked. I was grateful for that, even if her presence made the apartment feel charged with a tension I couldn't name. In the last months, when Thomas was mostly confined to bed, Eleanor and I maintained an uneasy truce built around our shared grief. We didn't talk much, but we moved around each other with a kind of careful tenderness, both of us trying to be what Thomas needed. The day Thomas died, Eleanor held one of his hands and I held the other. I will never forget that, the three of us together at the very end, whatever complicated history between us eclipsed completely by loss. After the funeral, Eleanor and I stayed in each other's lives out of a shared commitment to Thomas's memory. We had dinner once a month, called each other on Thomas's birthday, and on the anniversary of his death. It wasn't warm, exactly, but it was something. A connection to the man we'd both loved. I moved through grief the way everyone does, badly, then slightly less badly, then better, then worse again, with no predictable rhythm. I threw myself into my work, eventually landing a position as a professor of literature at a small college 2 hours from the city where Thomas and I had lived. I sold our apartment, adopted a cat named Henry, and slowly, painstakingly, rebuilt a life that had room for both grief and living. I dated a little, here and there. Nothing serious. My heart wasn't ready, and I'd made peace with the possibility that it might never be. Eleanor and I continued our monthly dinners for years. As time passed, the tension between us softened somewhat. Without Thomas in the middle to compete over, we could simply be two people who missed the same person. She started to seem almost fond of me. She asked about my students, my research, my writing. She remembered small details I'd mentioned in previous conversations. I let myself believe that we'd finally found our footing. That this was the relationship we might have had if Thomas's death hadn't shadowed everything. I was so wrong. The discovery happened on a Sunday afternoon in October, 6 years after Thomas died. I was visiting Eleanor at her home, a beautiful old brownstone in the city that she'd lived in for 40 years. She'd asked me to come by to help her sort through some boxes in the attic that she'd been meaning to deal with for years. She was thinking about selling the house, finally, and needed to decide what to keep and what to donate. "I need fresh eyes," she said on the phone. "You knew Thomas. You'll know what's worth saving." I drove down on a Saturday, and we spent an afternoon going through decades of accumulated belongings. Old photographs, letters, books, Thomas's childhood drawings, his report cards, his high school yearbooks. It was bittersweet and achingly tender, touching these artifacts of a life I'd only known in its final chapter. Eleanor prepared dinner, and I spent the night in her guest room rather than driving back late. The next morning, while Eleanor made breakfast downstairs, I went back to the attic alone to finish cataloguing the last few boxes we hadn't gotten to the day before. It was quiet and dusty up there, sunlight coming through a small circular window, and I felt close to Thomas in a way I hadn't in years. The last box I opened was tucked in the farthest corner of the attic, under an old canvas top. It was a plain cardboard box, sealed with packing tape that had yellowed with age. My name, Margaret, was written on the side in Thomas's handwriting. My heart stopped. I sat down on the dusty floor and stared at that box for a long time. Thomas's handwriting. My name. A box hidden under a top in his mother's attic. Why would Thomas have left a box labeled with my name at his mother's house? Why hadn't Eleanor told me it existed? My hands were shaking as I peeled back the tape. Inside was a layer of tissue paper. Under the tissue paper was a small wooden box, the kind with a clasp that you'd keep jewelry or keepsakes in. And beneath that was a thick envelope, unsealed, with my name on the front in Thomas's careful handwriting. I sat there for a long time before I opened the envelope. Inside were 15 pages of handwritten letters. Not one letter, multiple letters, written at different times, in different inks, with variations in Thomas's handwriting that suggested some were written early in his illness, and some were written later, when the tremor in his hands had already started. The first letter began, "Margaret, if you're reading this, it means my mother finally gave you this box. I hope she didn't wait too long." I read it 3 times before I could process what it said. Thomas had written these letters over the course of his illness. They were meant for me, specifically meant for me to read after his death. He'd given them to Eleanor for safekeeping, trusting her to pass them on. But she never had. In the first letter, Thomas wrote about his love for me, about the life we'd built, about his gratitude for the 4 years we'd had together. It was beautiful and heartbreaking, and I was already crying before I'd finished the first page. But as I kept reading, the letters changed tone. Because Thomas hadn't only written about his love for me. He'd also written about Eleanor. In a letter dated 3 months before his death, Thomas wrote, "Margaret, I need to tell you something I should have told you years ago, and I'm sorry I didn't have the courage to say it to your face. My mother is not who you think she is. She is not who I let you believe she was. And you deserve to know the truth." What followed across the next several pages of that letter and the ones after it was a confession I was completely unprepared for. Thomas wrote that Eleanor had spent years, not just after his diagnosis, but throughout our entire marriage, working to undermine our relationship. Not openly, not in ways I would easily recognize, but systematically and deliberately. She'd told Thomas repeatedly that I didn't really love him, that I'd married him for stability, for a life he could provide, that a woman as independent as me would eventually leave. She presented this not as cruelty, but as a mother's concern, as wanting to protect him from potential heartbreak. She'd intercepted communications. I had to read that line 4 times before I believed it. In the early days of our relationship, when Thomas and I were dating long distance during summer breaks and communicating partly by letter, yes, actual letters, because we were both sentimental that way, Eleanor had opened some of my letters before giving them to Thomas. She'd done the same with cards I'd sent for his birthdays, for their first Christmas together after we met. Thomas wrote that he hadn't known about the letters until years later, when he discovered one that Eleanor had opened and resealed. When he confronted her, she admitted it, claiming she'd only been worried about her son's well-being. But that wasn't the worst of it. Thomas wrote about a job offer, a position at an architecture firm in London that would have been a significant opportunity for him professionally. He'd applied during our second year of dating and received an offer. He'd been genuinely considering it, knowing it would complicate our relationship, but thinking it was worth discussing. He never got the chance to discuss it with me, because Eleanor told him I'd called her directly to say I would break up with him if he took the job. That I'd told Eleanor privately that I didn't want a long-distance relationship, and that if Thomas chose London over us, I was done. Thomas believed her. He turned down the job. I never made that call. I never said those words. I had no idea the offer had even existed until I read about it in a letter written by my dying husband, 6 years after he'd died. Thomas wrote, "I don't know why I believed her. Maybe because it was easier than confronting her about what she'd done. Maybe because I was young and insecure, and somewhere deep down, I was afraid it might be true. But I should have asked you. I should have trusted you. And I'm sorry." In a later letter, Thomas described finding out, just a few months before he died, about something else Eleanor had done. She had called my best friend, Rachel, early in our marriage. This was something I'd never known, never suspected. Eleanor had called Rachel and told her that she was worried about me, that I seemed unhappy in the marriage, that she'd overheard Thomas and me arguing about my career ambitions, that she was concerned that I was feeling trapped. None of this was true. But Eleanor had presented it with such maternal sincerity that Rachel had mentioned it to me with carefully worded concern. "I talked to Thomas's mom, and she seems worried about you. She said you two have been having some trouble." I'd been baffled. Thomas and I were fine. We had normal disagreements, but nothing that would prompt Eleanor to call my best friend in concern. I'd dismissed it as Eleanor being dramatic, meddling. What I hadn't realized was that Eleanor had been planting seeds. Small, careful seeds of doubt in the people around me. Creating a narrative, among Thomas's friends, among our mutual acquaintances, that our marriage was struggling. That I was unhappy. That Thomas deserved better. Thomas wrote that he hadn't known about the call to Rachel until he was going through Eleanor's phone one evening when she fell asleep in his hospital room. He'd been looking for her car service app to call her a car, and he'd seen her call history. I should have confronted her. I was too weak by then, too exhausted. I told myself I'd deal with it later, but there was no later. I'm asking you, from wherever I am now, to understand why I didn't tell you while I was alive. I was protecting you from pain. But I realize now that by protecting you, I was also leaving you with a relationship with her that was built on lies. The final letter in the stack was dated 10 days before Thomas died. His handwriting was barely legible, shaky and uneven. But the message was clear. Margaret. The box is at my mother's. I've told her to give it to you, but I'm afraid she won't. If you don't receive it within the first year after I'm gone, you'll need to go looking. I hope she does the right thing. I believe she loves you, in her way. But I've learned that her love and her control are so intertwined that even she can't tell them apart. Please know that I loved you without reservation, without condition, without the complicated strings that she attaches to everything. You were the best thing in my life. You deserved better than the truth I couldn't give you while I was alive. I was sitting on the attic floor, surrounded by boxes of Thomas's childhood, clutching his letters to my chest and sobbing so hard I could barely breathe, when Eleanor appeared in the attic doorway. She took one look at me and the open cardboard box, and her face went very still. You found it, she said quietly. You knew it was here. Yes. He told you to give this to me. 6 years ago. She came into the attic and sat down on an old trunk across from me, folding her hands in her lap with the composure of a woman who had spent decades maintaining composure at all costs. He did. Why didn't you? For a long moment, she didn't answer. And then, because I was afraid of what would happen when you read it. Afraid of what, exactly? That I'd be angry. That I'd stop coming to dinner once a month. That I'd finally see through you. That you'd stop seeing him as perfect. Her voice was very quiet, very controlled. Thomas blamed himself for not telling you these things while he was alive. He was ashamed. He thought if you knew about the job, about the things I did, you'd think less of him for not standing up to me. He was right that I'd have questions about that. But that wasn't your decision to make. He wrote these letters for me. He trusted you to deliver them. He also trusted me his whole life, and I let him down. I know that. She looked at her hands. I'm not going to sit here and tell you that what I did was right. It wasn't. I know it wasn't. Then why? Why did you do any of it? Why intercept my letters? Why lie to him about a phone call I never made? Why call Rachel and plant doubts? Eleanor was quiet for so long that I thought she wasn't going to answer. Then, because he was all I had. His father died when Thomas was 12. I spent the next 20 years with my son as the center of my world. He was everything, my purpose, my companion, my reason for every decision I made. And then he met you, and suddenly I wasn't the most important person in his life anymore. And I didn't know how to survive that. So you tried to destroy our marriage. I tried to protect my relationship with my son. By lying to him. By manipulating him. By treating me like a threat to be neutralized instead of a person he loved. Yes. The word came out small, almost childlike. I know how that sounds. I've had 6 years to sit with the knowledge of what I did. Do you think I don't know how terrible it was? I don't know what you know, Eleanor. I don't know who you are. I thought I was starting to know you, over these last few years. I thought we were becoming something like family. And now I find out that the entire history of my marriage was shaped by your interference in ways I never knew. The marriage was real, she said, and for the first time her voice cracked. Thomas loved you genuinely. What I did, the interference, it didn't manufacture your relationship. It couldn't have, even if I'd wanted it to. The love between you two was real. That's the one thing I couldn't control. But you tried to. You tried to make him doubt me. You tried to make my friends doubt us. You turned down a job offer on my behalf without my knowledge. I know. He turned down London for me, Eleanor. He gave up a significant career opportunity because you told him I'd issued an ultimatum I never issued. How many other things? How many decisions was he making based on lies you told him? She closed her eyes briefly. I don't know. I told myself small lies at the time. That I was just protecting him. That you would hurt him eventually anyway. That I was just giving history a small push in the direction it was going to go anyway. That's what you told yourself. Yes. I was very good at it. I stood up from the floor, my legs stiff, my chest aching. I looked at this woman, this elegant, composed, complicated woman who had loved her son so fiercely that she'd been willing to compromise his entire adult life to keep him close. I need to leave, I said. Margaret. I can't sit in this attic and process this right now. I need to go home and read these letters again, and figure out what I feel, and what I do with any of this. Are you going to cut off contact with me? I don't know. I honestly don't know. Eleanor stood up too. She looked, in that moment, very old. I understand. Whatever you decide, I want you to know something. She paused, choosing her words with care. I watched you love my son through his dying. I watched you sit with him, fight for him, hold him when he couldn't hold himself. Whatever I thought about you before, whatever I told myself to justify what I did, I saw who you really were during those 18 months. And I was wrong about you. I was wrong from the beginning. I picked up the box with Thomas's letters and walked out of the attic. I drove home in a kind of shocked silence, just me and the road and the autumn trees blurring past the windows. I stopped once at a gas station and sat in my car for 20 minutes, unable to move. At home, I sat at my kitchen table with Henry the cat in my lap and read all of Thomas's letters again, slowly this time, in order. I let myself feel every word. The love, the regret, the shame, the tenderness. The man I'd known, careful, thoughtful, kind, was present on every page. But so was a version of him I hadn't fully seen, while he was alive. A son so deeply entangled with his mother that he'd been unable to fully break free, even when he knew her behavior was wrong. I thought about all the years of our marriage. All the moments I'd sensed something just slightly off, an inexplicable tension, a conversation that felt like it was happening in two registers at once. I thought about the job offer I'd never known about, the life in London we'd never had, and whether that version of our life would have been better or worse or simply different. I thought about Eleanor, sitting in her attic. I called Rachel that night. I need to tell you something, and I need you to tell me exactly what you remember about a phone call from Eleanor, years ago. Rachel was quiet for a moment. Then, oh God, Maggie. I've thought about that call so many times over the years. I always felt bad about how I approached you about it. She seemed so genuinely concerned, and I didn't want to dismiss it. But you always seemed fine. She made it up. I need you to know that. There was no trouble. She called you to plant doubts, to build a narrative that our marriage was struggling. None of what she told you was true. Rachel was furious on my behalf. She used language I won't repeat here. I loved her for it, and I also gently told her that my anger needed somewhere more complicated to go. Because the truth was, the anger wasn't simple. It wasn't clean. I was angry at Eleanor, profoundly, deeply angry at the years of manipulation, the lies, the control. But I was also heartbroken in a new way for Thomas, who had known some of this and carried it alone. Who'd spent the last months of his life writing letters he hoped would reach me, trying to make right what he hadn't been able to fix in person, and beneath the anger was something even more complicated, grief. Fresh, raw grief for a version of my marriage I was only now discovering. For the conversations Thomas and I never had. For the complete honesty we never fully achieved, partly because he'd been too afraid of his mother to allow it. I saw my therapist twice the following week. She helped me untangle the layers. What's making this so complex, she said, is that you're not just processing what Eleanor did. You're also processing a new understanding of Thomas. A version of him that was flawed in ways you didn't fully see. Does that make me love him less? What do you think? No. But it makes me grieve differently. It's like losing him again, but losing a different version of him. The perfect version I'd been holding on to. And what's replacing that version? A real one. A more human one. Someone who was trying, who knew he was failing, who wrote 15 pages of letters trying to make it right. Is that worse or better? I thought about it for a long time. It's more honest, I said finally. It's more real. And I think real is better, even when it hurts more. I didn't call Eleanor for 3 weeks. When I finally did, it was a Sunday evening, and I'd spent the weekend rereading Thomas's letters and making a decision. I want to meet, I said when she answered. Neutral ground. A restaurant. Of course, she said immediately. Wherever you want. We met at a quiet Italian place midway between our homes. Eleanor was already there when I arrived, sitting very straight, looking like she hadn't slept well in weeks. Maybe months. I sat down, ordered water, and looked at her for a moment before I spoke. I've been trying to figure out what I want from this conversation. What I need. And I've realized it's simple, even if it's not easy. I need you to tell me everything. Everything. Every time you interfered. Every lie you told Thomas, everything you said to my friends or his friends, every way you shaped the narrative of our marriage from the outside. I need to know the full extent of it. She flinched. Margaret, I'm not sure how much. Everything, Eleanor. Or we're done. I can walk out of this restaurant and never see you again. I've survived losing Thomas. I can survive losing you too. She believed me, because it was true. And so she talked. It took 2 hours. 2 hours of Eleanor sitting across from me, her hands folded on the table, her voice steady though her eyes were wet, telling me the truth she'd been keeping for over a decade. My name is Margaret, and my husband died years ago. But the truth I discovered about his mother shocked me, changed me, and ultimately led me somewhere I never expected to go. Not to bitterness. Not to broken relationships and permanent damage. To honesty. To understanding. To a kind of imperfect, complicated, genuinely real life that Thomas, I think, would have wanted for me. And that, I've learned, is the best tribute I can give to the man who loved me, to live as fully and as honestly as he was trying to teach me to, right up until the very end. If this story touched you, if you've experienced complicated grief, unexpected betrayal, or the struggle to understand the people we love, please subscribe to this channel. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a story like this one. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever discovered a truth about someone after it was too late to address it with them? How did you find your way through? This community is a place for honest stories and real support. Thank you for being here, and thank you for listening. You are never as alone in your experiences as you feel.